The Laments of Our Ancient Civilization. Part 1. The Birth of the Humanization of Man. The Crisis of the Pagan Republic. The increasing militarization of families, transformed into factions, led to constant civil wars, death, and destruction within the Roman Republican society based on pagan religious values. The Republic and paganism were not enough to stop the fratricidal violence that tore the Roman state apart. The Republic of Rome was addicted to a representative system based on rigged elections, and the violence of games money machinations that turned the patrician Roman family into political mafias. Paganism, as a religion of the Roman state, was not a center for the irradiation of solid moral values or virtues, or yet, recommended patterns of social behavior, but was based on several gods lenient with the moral failures of their subjects, who appealed not to faith, but to the political bargain of a certain divine qui pro quo, give and take, which was invariably on the side of the powerful, of the families that formed the civic-military caste of the time. The pagan gods were powerful, inflexible, long-winded, even cruel Martian warriors, but totally lenient with the moral defects of their believers. An offering was enough, and everything was promptly solved. There was no notion of sin or virtues, only right and wrong, which was in turn based on a certain relativism that only described human weaknesses, which in the end, was well represented by their megalomaniac gods who killed, raped with crazy sexuality without moral restraints, since they were gods. The temples of pagan Rome were precincts of the Roman state, not places of worship, but closed areas for religious practices restricted to priests, who, as they were at the service of the state, served the interests of Roman families in a permanent situation of civil conflict. There was no concept of worship for the faithful, but of the practice of animal sacrifices in a soulless world. Only the gods had souls, and those belonging to the families of the civic-military caste. The People's Republic of Rome languished, religion was in crisis, traditional families were fighting in an endless mortal struggle for power. The Senate was only a stronghold of a caste of manipulators between being gods and mortal beings, between being generals and senators. Politics, like religion, had vague moral content that did not affect the powerful, that is, the pagan gods themselves and the Roman patrician families. The moral discourse of the Roman state was based on historical traditions, laws, and the power of traditional families. The concept of right or wrong was not clear, but the eternal relativism of qui pro quo, give and take. There was no history of man, but only the history of the pagan gods from Jupiter to Mars, from Apollo to Athens, and of his indwellings with the most powerful patrician families. In the end, the morality was the morality of convenience of the faction that won a civil war, and that obviously proceeded to obtain benefits from the pagan gods who had supposedly favored them in the art of war. The common man was only a victim of circumstances. He could be a slave, he could be a merchant, he could be a voting citizen in senatorial elections, but he was marginalized from the power that gravitated between gods available in the pagan pantheon, and the families of the Roman civic-military caste. The civil war, among Caesar, Pompey, and Scipio. The crisis of the Roman state, lost between consecutive civil wars, and in the weakening of moral values, which were already vague, was about to put Roman families in dispute, once again, in a confrontation among Caesar, Pompey and Scipio. Caesar represented the dictator who intended to protect the Roman state, Pompey, the general of the families who wanted to maintain at all costs the political games between pagan gods of relative morality, and the politicking of the Senate of Rome. In the midst of them, Scipio represented the political articulator and philosopher of the republican traditions of the Roman families belonging to the civic-military caste. Caesar's assassination shocked Roman republican institutions, desecrating their highest institution, which was the Senate itself. The message was too heavy for the fragility of the moment, and the result was an explosion of violence that resulted not only in a formidable civil war, but also in the emergence of other characters in the wake of the political consequences that followed Caesar's death, causing Caesar's own name to become part of the Roman institutions that would be born from the result of this civil war. Mark Antony as a military man had no legitimacy to influence the politics of the Senate of Rome. Octavian, declared Caesar's legal heir, was still very young. Pompey was a decadent and fearful general, and Scipio, the ideologue of ancient Rome, saw the concepts of his Roman Republic based on the traditions of patrician families and their pagan gods to agonize. This crisis lasted for decades, creating conditions for the slowly emergence of not only a new character who would radically change the concepts of ancient Rome, but who would mean the birth of what we now know as the Roman Empire, and paradoxically close to the time of the birth of the Christian era, in the year 44 AD, Anno Domini. The unfolding of this historical drama had interesting contours from a Roman general Mark Antony, who sought recognition and legitimacy from the power of Roman families, marrying first Octavian's sister and Caesar's niece, and then to turn the tables for good, marrying Queen Cleopatra, who was fighting to keep the Ptolemaic dynasty in power in Alexandria and Egypt. The union of Mark Antony and Cleopatra presented unprecedented political moves in the history of the Roman Republic, which justified the rise of a Roman general through a certain and imprecise noble title of possible king from Cleopatra, basing his legitimacy on the Greco-Ptolemaic monarchy that originated from Alexander's conquests over Egypt, having the traditions of Greco-Egyptian royalty as grounds for claiming power in Rome. The Republic of Rome was rapidly dying. From this seemingly unbeatable strategy of General Mark Antony came a very different result with Octavian's rise to power, but with similar nuances, as Caesar's nephew had become not only Caesar Augustus, but had made his uncle Caesar's own name into an imperial Roman institution, taking upon himself the title of Imperator, Generalissimo, which was at the same time a military concept and the foundations of what would become the Roman Empire. The birth of the Roman Empire. As we can see, the People's Republic of Rome was shipwrecked in the concepts of a very ambiguous empire that at first reinforced the traditions of the Roman patrician families, initially creating a dynasty that went from Caesar to Nero, passing through its founder Caesar Augustus, Octavian. However, in a second moment, the Roman Empire passes into the hands of General Vespasian, who after the end of Nero's reign, becomes an institution based mainly on militarism, with the term imperator being much closer to that of a general than to that of an emperor of noble traditions, or even of a monarchical nature. The Republic of Rome was definitively extinct, but, curiously, until its last emperor, Romulus Augustus in the year 476 AD, always referred to its state institutions as the Republic of the People of Rome. In the end, the Roman Empire was never a monarchical institution, but a militaristic empire. Octavian's rise as Caesar, and at the same time Augustus, was obviously the centralization of power in Rome in the hands of a single patrician family, of a dynasty fated to maintain the traditions of all patrician families summarized in a single one, ending the civil wars, and giving predictability to the succession process, ensuring smoother transitions of power. This lasted from Octavian to Nero. Roman traditions, from senatorial politics to their pagan gods, were passed generation after generation in a succession of descendants of patrician values, having their legitimacy based on the very institutions of noble Roman families. Undeniably, Octavian, Caesar's nephew, moved Roman history toward a monarchy, a concept that had bad historical connotations associated with tyrannies in the context of Roman traditions, but Caesar Augustus came to surreptitiously represent a monarchical institution in disguise with the goal of creating political and social stability, by reinforcing traditions in a hereditary succession of patrician families in power. The immediate consequence of Caesar Augustus' rise to power was the weakening of the Senate, which was ultimately the source of the politicking of the civic-military caste, that traditionally had created political instability in Rome. The second consequence, paradoxically, was the militarization of Roman institutions themselves through what became known as the Pax Romana, confusing the term imperator with that of a general, rather than that of a king based on a succession of monarchical descent. The army became the source of power of the Roman Empire, and of the consolidation of the traditions and institutions of the imperial Republic of the People of Rome. The crisis of paganism and the Roman Empire. The Pax Romana was slowly decomposing, as the empire itself was slowly dissolving from the laceration of its political and religious institutions. What we call today the ancient world was moving rapidly towards its end along with the Roman Empire. The end of the ancient world is based mainly on the crisis that paganism begins to face with the slow discrediting of its institutions, based on gods without relevant moral values, and permeated by the relativism of right and wrong, and a certain divine qui pro quo, give and take, through offerings in pagan temples. In their eagerness to justify more followers, the pagan gods do not punish, nor forgive, but bargain. In this way, everything is allowed, and the institutions of the Roman state enter into a crisis not only political and social, but morally. Rome was not a country, but a city that through its army dominated several cities and territories. However, there were no links between these cities and these territories with the history of the city of Rome. Roman traditions lived in the shadows of the Roman colonizers and their armies, and the veneration of these political and religious institutions did not extend much beyond the buildings and forums of monumental architecture that ultimately represented Rome. There were no social ties between the parts of the empire, only a political domination of mutual economic interests, since Rome with 1 million inhabitants constituted a formidable market for this ancient Mediterranean world. The progressive militarization of the Roman Empire led to a progressive degeneration in the transmission of traditional values through the patrician families, which were no longer transmitted by these families in the exercise of power, but by the imperator general who provide bread and circuses. It was during the reign of General Vespasian that the Colosseum in Rome was built, where art was constituted in the circus art of pagan gladiators. For a world of pagan gods of relative morality, the military was misconfused with dehumanization itself, since the history of man was just born, and there was not yet this concept of being human. The crisis of the Roman Empire was that of a country fragmented into several colonies that did not share the same ethnic, racial, linguistic, or social values. Their religion was based on a paganism that did not reinforce moral values or virtues, but was based only on the economic bargaining of the traditional, give and take, and on the absence of any form of humanization, but of a military brutality well represented by the deadly games in the Colosseum. In this context, the fragmentation of the empire became progressive, without an economy of values that could well represent the economic power of Rome, but only circumstantial interests. Roman domination over the Mare Nostrum did not generate enough income for an empire with ever-increasing military needs to keep all the subjugated in line. The ancient world was in agony, not only because of the economic decay of Rome, but also because of the growing discredit that the pagan gods began to suffer without showing results in their moral bargains, becoming a foolish and useless mysticism, without ethics, without morals, and without significant meaning. This moral crisis of the gods of paganism went from Egypt to Rome, passing through Delphi, and the various pilgrimage centers on the shores of the Mediterranean. Within their beliefs, the demoralization of temples managed by prostitutes to effeminate gods, or of dubious sexuality such as Apollo, often represented in statuettes posing with a clearly erotic nature, or even the god Pan stuffing his face, and copulating with a goat, was fostered. The sexuality freed from moral censorship of pagan religion represented this moral decadence of paganism, with bathhouses and saunas turned into centers of promiscuity and prostitution. In the city of Pompeii, rediscovered from the ashes of Vesuvius, it is still possible to see representations of penises scattered throughout the city, indicating that this or that residents rented rooms for prostitution. In this environment of decadence, the empire dragged with it the entire ancient world that maintained relations with Rome to their mutual and inevitable end. Wars became continuous, economic relations increasingly fragile. The demoralization of pagan religions was a constant reason for jokes for those who went to Delphi in search of answers for the future. The problem of the pagan gods was not to predict the future, but to redefine the state in which the present was to be. The humanization of man and Emperor Constantine. As we said at the beginning, the birth of the Roman Empire, so to speak, coincides with the beginning of Christianity in the year 44 AD, Anno Domini. The growth with which Christianity spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire is closely related to the contribution of Christ in the humanization of man, especially the ancient man lost in the midst of the moral bargains of the pagan gods, impacting the entire religious culture of the ancient world of gods with jackal heads, priestesses as prostitutes, pansexual gods, the predominance of the oniric and the supernatural, the consecration of human defects as virtues. After all, paganism sold the idea that man was an animal. The sense of humanity existed only for the gods and emperors venerated in closed temples where ordinary men could not enter. The Church of Christ becomes an open church of men, not of gods, and the Christian temples not only the house of God, but the house that was open to all men, who participated in the liturgies and celebration together with the priests anointed by God, and momentarily their representatives. This communion of man with God in the Christian churches boosted the humanization of man, who was no longer the victim of strange beings with the head of a jackal, or who copulated, got drunk, had rampants of anger and desires for revenge and out-of-control sexuality. In short, pagan gods who transformed moral defects into virtues. Christ revolutionized the notion of God and religion in the ancient and pagan world, transforming man into the protagonist of his own history. God was their supreme inspiration, and the church as a center of pilgrimage in search of the virtues that liberated, and not of Pythonesses who foresaw the future in a state of ecstasy. Finally, the humanization of man that made him the protagonist of his own history, freed from mysticism, from the moral bargain of pagan gods that were not at all credible, but of a unique God worshipped because he frees freely based only on the virtues of man without the need to bargain for anything, establishing man's conflict between good and evil, between the profane and the divine, between being and the nothingness. The constant crises of the empire led the Roman general, Imperator, Constantine to lean towards this new vision of humanization of man, which quickly contaminated the moral values of that ancient pantheon of pagan gods that was falling apart, redefining man not only at the center of religion, at the center of society, but also at the center of the Roman state itself, which was becoming Christianized. Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman state around 410 AD, founding Constantinople as the center of this new Christian Roman Empire that would last for more than 1,000 years until 1453 AD, Anno Domini. The centers of pagan pilgrimage became obsolete, and were one by one being closed. The ancient world was falling apart, and the era of just one moral god was born, becoming the central object of humanism for men and religions. Rome, however, continued to maintain certain pagan festival traditions, and in 476 AD, the last Roman emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, officially ending the pagan Roman Empire, and being reborn in the Greco-Byzantine Christian form of Constantinople. By Professor Ricardo Gomes Rodrigues, San Carlos, São Paulo, Brazil, July 19, 2024.